Officer arrests black veteran for no reason, then discovers he's a Medal of Honor recipient. The late afternoon sun was slipping behind the trees as Officer Mike Dawson drove down Crestwood's quiet streets. The day had been routine, how he liked it. But as he passed rows of clean driveways and shiny cars, something flickered inside him, a sense he couldn't shake. Then he spotted it. An old, beat-up truck sputtering along the road. Didn't belong here. Neither did the man driving it. A black man, probably mid-40s, in a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Dawson's hand twitched on the steering wheel. Why's this guy cruising through here? The truck slowed at a stop sign, and that was enough for Dawson. He flipped the lights. The familiar red and blue strobes splashed across the street. The truck pulled over, and Dawson parked behind it, stepping out slowly, hand resting on his holstered gun like it was second nature. His heart picked up speed as he approached. "License and registration," Dawson demanded, voice harsher than he intended. The man behind the wheel, Robert Jones, met his gaze with a calmness that unsettled Dawson. "Sure thing, officer," Jones said, his tone measured, movements deliberate as he reached for the glove compartment. His eyes flicked to Dawson, watching him, but not out of fear, out of familiarity, like he'd done this dance too many times. Dawson scanned the documents. Robert Jones. The name felt familiar, but distant, like a name he'd overheard at some point, but couldn't place. He hesitated, then asked, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "Visiting a friend," Jones replied, handing over his papers. His voice was even polite, but there was something beneath it, something Dawson couldn't pinpoint. "You don't live around here." Dawson's question came out harder than he'd intended, but it was too late to reel it back. "I live across town," Jones said, his eyebrows knitting together in subtle confusion. "Just passing through." Dawson's jaw tightened. His eyes swept over the truck, over Jones. He felt the urge to push. "Step out of the vehicle." Jones paused, a flicker of something crossing his face, a question he didn't ask aloud. He moved slowly, carefully, unbuckling his seatbelt before stepping out. Dawson's grip on his belt tightened. "You carrying any weapons?" Dawson asked, his voice taking on a mechanical edge. "No, officer. I'm just here to visit a friend." Jones stood still, his body calm but rigid, arms by his sides, as if he knew the wrong move could shift the balance. Dawson caught the subtle clenching of Jones' jaw, the only break in his composure. "Turn around, hands on the truck," Dawson ordered, the words slipping out faster than he'd meant. Jones complied, but Dawson noticed his fingers tapping lightly on the truck bed, just once, like he was grounding himself. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jones asked over his shoulder, his voice quiet, almost resigned. Dawson didn't respond. His hands shook as he fumbled with the cuffs, slapping them around Jones's wrists with a snap that felt too loud in the quiet street. A few neighbors had come out onto their porches, watching from a distance. "What's he doing?" A woman called out, her voice high and tentative. Dawson ignored her, focusing on the radio as he called in the stop, his hand trembling as he gripped the mic. From the corner of his eye, he saw more people gathering, eyes narrowing, whispers starting. "That's Robert, isn't it?" A man asked, stepping closer. "He's been here before. Why's he getting cuffed?" The murmurs were soft but steady, building like a low hum in the air. Dawson felt their gaze, the heat of it crawling up his back. His chest tightened. He looked down at Jones, whose eyes met his, filled not with fear or anger, but with disappointment. "You've gone too far," a voice inside Dawson whispered, but he swallowed it down, focusing on his grip on the cuffs. Asterisk, asterisk, control, asterisk, asterisk. He needed to control this. Jones shifted slightly, turning his head just enough to speak over his shoulder. "Officer, what's going on?" Dawson opened his mouth, but no words came. His hand rested on Jones's back, a hollow weight pressing into his chest. He felt the crowd's quiet judgment behind him, their uncertainty growing heavier with each second. "I'm just doing my job," Dawson muttered, but the words rang false. Even he didn't believe them. The cuffs stayed on, but his grip on the situation had slipped. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. The weight of the moment pressed down on Dawson, forcing him to face the reflection of himself in the truck's side mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't like what he saw. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, its golden light stretching shadows across the street. Officer Mike Dawson stood rigid, his hand resting on Robert Jones's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath through the fabric of Jones's shirt. The crowd had started to gather, their voices like a low murmur, buzzing with curiosity and unease. A woman in a worn sweater stepped out from her porch, clutching a small child to her side. Her voice trembled, but she managed to speak up. "Officer, what's going on here?" She glanced nervously between Dawson and Jones, her grip tightening on her daughter's hand. "Routine stop," Dawson replied, his voice flat and lacking conviction. He didn't even bother looking at her, his focus locked on the man in cuffs. But his words felt wrong, like a bad script, as if he didn't believe them himself. From the crowd, a man with a baseball cap, his arms crossed over a work-stained shirt, stepped forward. "Routine. You don't cuff a man during a routine stop. What's this really about?" His voice was steady but carried an edge, and his question hung in the air. Dawson's pulse quickened. He tried to keep his face neutral, but the crowd's murmurs were getting under his skin. "You don't know the full story," he snapped, the words sharp and defensive. "Neither do you, looks like," the man shot back, the corners of his mouth tightening as he shifted his weight forward. Jones, still leaning against his truck, turned his head slightly, catching Dawson's reflection in the side mirror. His face was calm, but his eyes held something deeper, a quiet patience mixed with weariness. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice steady, though a trace of exhaustion lined the words. Dawson's fingers flexed around the cuffs, the knuckles whitening. Sweat had started to form on his brow. "You were driving suspiciously," he said, but even as he spoke, he knew how hollow the accusation sounded. He shifted on his feet, avoiding the growing eyes of the crowd. "I was driving home," Jones said, his voice soft but carrying weight. "You don't think I belong here, is that it?" He didn't raise his voice, didn't push. It was just a question, but it landed hard. Before Dawson could respond, a teenage boy, slouched against his bike at the edge of the crowd, spoke up, his tone laced with skepticism. "So, what? He looks like trouble to you just 'cause he's black." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a ripple of agreement moving through them. Dawson's heart thudded in his chest. "Back off," he barked, his voice rising an octave, trying to sound authoritative, but there was a crack in his tone. Jones straightened, turning slightly to face Dawson. His expression didn't change, but his voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "Do you even know who I am, officer?" The question took Dawson by surprise. He blinked, trying to mask his confusion. "Does it matter?" he muttered, though the words didn't feel like his own. "You're just another driver breaking the law." Jones's lips pressed together, and for the first time, his calm exterior showed flicker of frustration. "I'm a veteran," he said, his voice tightening. "I've served this country. You think I don't know what this is?" The realization hit Dawson like a cold punch to the gut. Robert Jones, the name was familiar, suddenly sparking a memory. A Medal of Honor recipient. Dawson had read about him before, but it hadn't registered until now. His stomach churned with guilt, though he tried to keep his face blank. From behind, a man's voice rang out, louder than before. "Let him go, for God's sake. He's a veteran, not a criminal." The crowd shifted, their growing agitation impossible to ignore. Dawson could feel their judgment, their disbelief. He was losing control, and he knew it. The pressure was mounting, pressing down on him from all sides. A young girl near the front crossed her arms and muttered, "Figures. Cops always go after the wrong people." Dawson's grip on the cuffs faltered for a second, his hands trembling. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control, to justify the mess he had created. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Some people scoffed, others shook their heads, the disbelief palpable. Jones tilted his head, just enough to meet Dawson's gaze. His voice was low, but steady, each word deliberate. "You have a choice right now. You can end this, or you can make it worse. I'm not your enemy." Dawson's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the crowd. He looked at Jones, really looked at him, and felt the weight of his words. There was no malice, no aggression in his tone. Just a man standing in front of him, asking for decency. A heavy silence settled over the street. The crowd wasn't jeering anymore. They were waiting, watching. Dawson's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, his hands loosening on the cuffs. His grip on the situation, on himself, felt like it was slipping, and maybe, just maybe, that was okay. He hesitated, glancing at the crowd, at Jones, at the fading light of the day. "All right," he muttered, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "Let's talk." The tension in the air didn't break, but it shifted. The crowd stayed put, skeptical but no longer hostile. And for the first time, Dawson felt the full weight of his actions. This wasn't control, it was something else entirely. He wasn't sure what came next, but as he took another step back, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Jones straightened, his eyes locking on Dawson's, calm but resolute. "Then let's talk." The air hung heavy, thick with the tension simmering between Officer Dawson and the crowd. Each pair of eyes was on him, their unspoken judgment pressing into his chest. He took a step back from Jones, the metallic click of the handcuffs sharp against the uncomfortable silence. But the act hadn't changed anything. The crowd watched, waiting. Jones stood tall, hands still bound, his posture daring Dawson to either go further or stop. "Let's talk," Dawson said, his voice low, uncertain. He swallowed hard, glancing at the faces before him. Skepticism rippled through the crowd, an energy that made his skin prickle. He knew it wasn't enough. Talking rarely was. "Talk." A woman pushed her way to the front, arms crossed, her jaw set. "That's all you got. You just cuffed this man in front of everyone, and now you want to talk." "Yeah," came a shout from behind her, followed by murmurs of agreement. The crowd inched closer, wanting more than words. Dawson's pulse quickened. "I'm trying," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, more to stall than explain. His gaze slid back to Jones, who remained calm but watchful, eyes narrowed as if weighing every move Dawson made. "Trying?" A teenage boy's voice cut through the tension, sharp and full of anger. "You don't get to try. This ain't about your learning curve. You put him in cuffs. Fix it." Dawson's gut twisted. He glanced at Jones, who for the first time spoke up. "You thought I was a threat, didn't you? Why? Because of my truck? Or because I don't look like I belong here?" The accusation landed hard, like a stone sinking into deep water. Dawson flinched but couldn't meet Jones' gaze. "I thought," he stammered, fumbling for words that wouldn't come. "I thought I was doing my job." Jones scoffed, his voice cold. "Your job is to protect and serve, not profile me. But you made a choice the moment you saw me." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, stoked by Jones' words. Dawson felt the weight of his uniform grow heavier. The sun felt hotter now, the sweat beating at the back of his neck, a reminder of how exposed he was. "You're standing there like it's all about you, officer," said a man from the crowd, his voice bitter. "But it's not. It's about what we live every single day." Dawson's throat tightened. Their anger was thick, choking, like smoke filling his lungs. Confrontations were part of his job, but this was something different, a reckoning with himself. Jones's voice broke through his swirling thoughts. "The question is, officer, what are you going to do about it? You've got a choice right now. Are you going to be part of the problem or part of the solution?" Dawson's heart pounded. He looked at Jones, really looked at him, and something shifted. This man had served his country, faced danger for others, while he, Dawson, had assumed the worst. Shame crept up his spine like ice water, cold and suffocating. "I can do better," Dawson whispered, his voice barely reaching beyond Jones. He cleared his throat, louder now. "I need to do better." The crowd fell silent, some faces softening with curiosity, others still hardened with skepticism. Dawson stood on the edge of a precipice, balancing between apology and accountability, but the words felt fragile, like they could snap at any moment. Jones studied him, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Then let's start with you letting me go." Dawson hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the cuffs. The sound of the lock releasing echoed louder than it should have. The crowd reacted, a mix of relief and disbelief, but the tension lingered, still unbroken. "Thank you," Jones said, rubbing his wrists. His tone carried no warmth, just acknowledgement. Dawson nodded, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. He turned to the crowd, his voice firmer but still unsteady. "I can't undo what I did today, but I'll learn from it. We need change, and I'm ready to work for it." A voice scoffed from the back. "Change. We've heard that before." Dawson's gaze shifted to the man who had spoken, his arms crossed, his face twisted with distrust. He wasn't wrong. Promises of change had come before, but actions had always been slow. "You can say you'll change," the man continued, his voice rising, "but when it comes down to it, will you stand with us? Will you actually do something?" Dawson swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to believe in what he was saying, but their doubt gnawed at him. "I will," he said, more certain this time. "I won't just stand with you. I'll work to make sure others do too." The crowd murmured again, still unsure. They'd heard it all before. A woman from earlier stepped forward, her expression softer but cautious. "We'll see, officer. We'll be watching." Jones stepped aside, no longer the focus but still crucial to the moment. He didn't offer Dawson absolution, only a nod, a small acknowledgement of what had happened. Maybe that was all Dawson could hope for. As the crowd slowly dispersed, some lingered in small groups, talking quietly. The tension had eased, but a layer of distrust remained, like the air after a storm, thick with the promise that another one could roll in any minute. Dawson stood still, his back to the setting sun, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The crowd was no longer passive. They were angry, their voices growing louder with each second. Dawson could feel their collective gaze, burning with judgment. Every stare, every murmur, amplified the weight of his mistake, sinking in deeper than the heat of the sun beating down on him. Jones, though still calm, had a subtle authority in his stance. He didn't need to raise his voice to make his point. After a moment, he pulled out his phone, making a quick, quiet call. His movements were measured, deliberate, and it only added to the rising tension. Dawson couldn't take his eyes off him, dreading whatever was coming next. When Jones finally spoke, his words were like a cold wind cutting through the heat. "Officer Dawson," he said, his tone firm but steady, "you've made a serious mistake." Dawson flinched, the shame settling deeper in his chest. I didn't mean to. I know exactly what you meant," Jones cut in, his voice sharp without rising. "You saw me, and you assumed I didn't belong. You didn't ask questions. You just acted on your prejudice." The truth in those words hit harder than any shove or punch. Dawson opened his mouth to defend himself, but nothing came. There was nothing he could say that would make this right. As if on cue, the low hum of an approaching car broke the moment. A sleek black vehicle rolled to a stop at the edge of the scene. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. He moved with purpose, heading straight for Jones. Without a word, he shook Jones's hand before turning to Dawson. "Officer," he said, handing him a business card, "I'll be representing Mr. Jones moving forward. I suggest you get your version of events in order." The card felt heavy in Dawson's hand, like a physical manifestation of the consequences awaiting him. He glanced down at it, but his vision blurred, the letters swimming in front of him as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Jones, standing by the open door of the car, looked back at Dawson one final time. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of disappointment, and something Dawson couldn't quite place. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," Jones said, his voice calm but firm. And then he was gone, sliding into the car, and leaving Dawson standing there, surrounded by the crowd's murmurs, the weight of his own actions pressing down like a boulder he couldn't move. The gravity of his mistake was undeniable now, and no badge could shield him from the truth of it. By Friday, Dawson was a ghost in his own home. The TV flickered in front of him, but he wasn't watching. The same images played on a loop in his mind: Jones's calm face, the crowd's anger, and his own hands snapping the cuffs around the wrong man's wrists. He was on every news channel. "Racist cop arrests Black war hero" had been the headline for days. Each new broadcast felt like a fresh wave of shame. The phrase administrative leave pending investigation cut deep when his captain had said it, but not as deep as the look on Amy's face that night. She didn't yell or break down. She just sat across from him at the dinner table, quiet for what felt like hours. When she finally spoke, it was worse than anger. "What the hell happened out there, Matt?" He didn't know what to say. How do you explain something you can't even fully understand yourself? The news droned on in the background, replaying the same footage that had already gone viral: Dawson arresting Robert Jones, a Medal of Honor recipient. The story had become fuel for calls to reform police accountability. Racial profiling debates ignited across the country. Dawson muted the TV. His phone buzzed incessantly: texts, emails, social media notifications. Some were from people offering weak support. Most were from people who wanted to see him burn for what he'd done. The emails from his bosses were clinical and cold. The union wasn't rushing to his defense, either. It felt like everyone had decided his fate before he'd even had a chance to explain. His chest tightened. He hadn't slept in days. The weight of the mistake replayed over and over. Robert Jones, decorated soldier, upstanding citizen, wrongfully treated like a criminal because Dawson had let his prejudice cloud his judgment. A knock on the door snapped him out of his daze. Amy stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Dinner's ready." He followed her into the kitchen. They sat in silence, just the sound of utensils scraping plates between them. Their kids, Emma and Tommy, were at Amy's parents' house for the weekend. It felt like a relief. At least they wouldn't have to face the awkward tension at home for a while. "It's not just your job on the line," Amy said, breaking the silence, her voice sharp but calm. "It's our life, Matt, our family." He looked up, guilt pressing down on him. "I know." "No, I don't think you do," she shot back, setting her fork down. "The kids hear things at school. People talk. They're calling you a racist, and what am I supposed to say? What do I tell Emma and Tommy when they ask why their dad's all over the news?" Her words cut deeper than any headline or angry mob ever could. He hadn't thought about how far the ripple effects would spread, how his actions wouldn't just destroy his career, but hurt his family too. "I'm trying, Amy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to fix it." "How?" "By sitting on the couch all day, hoping this'll blow over. It's not going away, Matt. You can't just wait for things to go back to normal. They won't." She was right. And the worst part, he knew it, but knowing didn't make it any easier. He felt trapped, drowning in a sea of consequences he'd set into motion but couldn't control anymore. "I'm sorry," he muttered, but even he didn't believe the words. They felt hollow, said out of habit rather than meaning. Amy sighed, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Being sorry doesn't change what happened. You need to figure out how to make this right for all of us. The next day, Dawson sat in his patrol car in front of the station. He wasn't supposed to be there, but home felt unbearable. He stared at the steering wheel, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. The investigation was moving faster than he'd expected. His career wasn't just in jeopardy, it was likely over. The department needed to make an example of someone, and he was an easy target. A racist cop arresting a war hero. It didn't get any worse than that. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. He thought back to the moment with Robert Jones, how everything had spiraled out of control so fast. The crowd's anger, Jones's steady words cutting through his excuses, and then the look in Jones's eyes. Disappointment, maybe even pity. The world wanted Dawson's head on a platter now, and nothing short of total destruction seemed enough. A knock on his window startled him. Officer Linda Ramirez, his partner, stood outside, her face grim. He rolled down the window. "You okay?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. "Yeah, just thinking," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "You hear anything?" She nodded. "They're pushing for suspension. Indefinite." The words hit like a punch to the gut. "That bad, huh?" "Yeah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Matt, you need to prepare yourself. This might be the end." He slumped back in his seat, the reality sinking in. His career, his identity as a cop, it could all be gone soon. And not because of a single mistake, but because of years of unexamined bias coming to a head in the worst possible way. "You should go home," Ramirez added gently. "Your family needs you right now." He nodded, but home didn't feel like a safe place anymore. Nowhere did. As she walked away, Dawson sat alone, staring out the windshield. He wasn't sure if he deserved redemption or if this was the lesson he needed, too late as it was. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. Weeks had passed since the day that flipped Officer Dawson's life upside down. The story of his botched arrest had long faded from the headlines, but the real work, the tough, messy, unglamorous work, was just beginning. Conversations about race, accountability, and trust still echoed through the town, seeping into living rooms, parks, and schools. People who had never talked about such things found themselves wrestling with uncomfortable truths, forced to reckon with their own assumptions. Jones, the war hero turned unlikely local activist, found himself standing at the center of it all. He hadn't asked for this role, but once the spotlight found him, he leaned into it, knowing his story carried weight. He began attending community gatherings, not as a symbol, but as a man with a voice. At town halls, he spoke of service, both in war and in peace. He reminded people of the importance of seeing beyond uniforms, badges, and skin color. His words weren't rehearsed or idealistic. They came from the battlefield of experience, scared by the same biases he now urged people to dismantle. One afternoon, after a particularly charged town meeting, Jones found Dawson sitting in his patrol car outside the courthouse. The two exchanged a nod, not of approval, but of understanding. They hadn't magically become best friends. There were no long, heartfelt talks to smooth over what had happened. But there was respect, a fragile thing that had to be built brick by brick, slow and steady. Dawson's life had been far from a tidy redemption arc. The internal investigation at the department had ended with him still on the force, but he was no longer the officer he had been. The uniform didn't fit quite the same anymore. He attended bias training, not because it was mandatory, but because it was necessary for himself. He no longer saw the world in black and white, but in shades of gray, colors he'd once been too blind to notice. The weight of his badge had shifted from authority to responsibility, and that change was uncomfortable, heavy in ways he didn't expect. At home, things weren't easy either. His wife, Amy, hadn't just forgiven and forgotten. The looks from neighbors, the whispered questions she got when picking up their kids from school, they stuck with her. Their conversations were strained, quieter than they used to be. But they hadn't given up on each other, even when it felt easier to walk away. On a crisp evening in early fall, the community held a rally in the park. It wasn't a celebration of change, but an acknowledgement that more needed to be done. Jones stood in front of the crowd, his voice clear but unassuming. "Change isn't something you check off a list," he said, scanning the faces before him. "It's a process, a constant struggle. We can't fix what's broken overnight, but we can make the decision to keep trying, to hold each other accountable." The crowd clapped, but not in the raucous, movie-ending way. It was softer, reflective, as if they knew the applause wasn't for a job well done, but for the promise to keep going. Dawson stood at the edge of the gathering, arms folded, watching. He wasn't the star of this story anymore, and that was fine by him. He still had work to do, within himself, within his family, and within the community he was supposed to serve. Nothing about this new beginning felt simple or comfortable, and that was exactly the point. Jones stepped down from the stage and caught Dawson's eye. The two men exchanged another nod, this one deeper, more meaningful. It wasn't a conclusion, but an acknowledgement that their journeys, separate but intertwined, were far from over. And as the crowd dispersed, there was no swelling of music, no dramatic close. Just life, complicated and unvarnished, continuing on. As we reflect on the events that brought Officer Dawson and Robert Jones together, we must recognize the importance of standing up for what is right. Every one of us has the power to make a difference in our communities. Engage in conversations. Talk to your neighbors, friends, and family about issues of race and justice. Listen to their stories, share your own, and strive to understand perspectives that may differ from your own. Educate yourself. Attend local meetings, workshops, or discussions on racial bias, community policing, and social justice. Knowledge is a powerful tool for change. Support local initiatives. Get involved with local organizations that advocate for civil rights and social justice. Your time and efforts can help build a stronger, more equitable community. Hold authorities accountable. Advocate for transparency and accountability within law enforcement. Encourage your local police departments to implement bias training and community engagement strategies. Stand up against injustice. When you witness acts of discrimination or injustice, speak out. Your voice can contribute to a larger movement toward equality and respect for all. Together, we can foster an environment where justice is not just a word, but a lived reality for everyone. Let's work hand in hand, ensuring that our communities are safe, inclusive, and respectful for all individuals, regardless of their background. Change begins with us.